to my channel. My name's Michelle, and around here we talk about 18th century women's history and what it's like to be a rookie novelist. Today I want to talk about a week in 1765 where the weather was hot, tensions were high, and violence broke out across Annapolis, Maryland. Let's get into it. All right, I want to set the stage by reading a quote. This is from Charles Townshend. He was the Chancellor of the English Exchequer at the time. And he said, "If America looks to Great Britain for protection, she must enable us to protect her. If she expects our fleets, she must assist our revenue." Now, Prime Minister George Grenville agreed. And so he spent about a year working with agents in the American colonies to come up with a tax plan. And what they came up with actually should have been really great. The tax itself wouldn't be that high, and it would be applied fairly unobtrusively. What they would do is for official documents in the colonies, so think of things like contracts and government proclamations and legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, all of those things would be printed on special paper that had a stamp on it. So instead of paying the tax outright, colonists would just go to agents who sold this paper and purchase the paper for their newspapers and pamphlets and legal documents and such. This was an excellent plan because it applied equitably across the colonies, right? So you only paid for what you purchased. That also meant that the revenue from this tax could grow as the colonies grew, because they would be using more paper for their newspapers and their legal documents and their contracts. This should have worked really well. And in fact, the tax itself wasn't all that high. And yet things fell apart across the colonies. And today we're going to talk about what happened in Annapolis, Maryland. Zachariah Hood was in London at the time that the Stamp Act passed, and he lobbied to become a stamp agent in Maryland. But before he could even get to Annapolis, things got rough. A not inconsiderable amount of people created an effigy of Zachariah Hood. They put it on a cart and they marched it through town. There were bells tolling solemnly in the background. They got to the State House where they gave a bunch of riotous speeches. They built a scaffold. They hung the effigy. And then underneath it, they placed a tar barrel, which they lit on fire, and they burned the whole thing down. Zachariah Hood couldn't have felt very welcome coming to Annapolis at that point. Zachariah Hood was hung in effigy on August 26th. But he arrived in Annapolis and he rented out some space from Anne Berman Gaither. He was going to use this building as a warehouse for the stamp paper, and he hired Wright Mills, a carpenter, to help set up a storefront in the front of the building where he could sell the stamped paper. Before he could even get things set up, a crowd of between 200 and 400 people, according to Governor Horatio Sharp, showed up at the house and tore it down to the ground. Zachariah Hood was terrified, and even though Horatio Sharp offered him a safe place to stay, he immediately raced to New York. I want to read you a message that he sent to Benjamin Franklin because I think it captures just how scared he was. He said, "Our province," meaning Maryland, "is extremely heated. They have cut an officer of the tender in a shocking manner, pulled down my house, and obliged me to flee with a single suit or expect the same fate as the officer." Now, eventually Anne Berman would receive some compensation for the building that she lost, and Wright Mills would also receive some compensation for tools that he had left on site. But this happened on September 2nd. So a lot of violence in a very short time in Annapolis. This type of political violence was pretty unusual for Annapolis. So to have another incident happen on September 4th was shocking. A British warship was anchored in Annapolis Harbor, and a group of folks from town hopped into a boat and they rowed out there. They wanted to see if the ship had any of the stamped paper on board. Now, Lieutenant Mowbray, who was in charge here, said, "Get out, like, this isn't happening," and sent them away. But then later, the lieutenant and some of the passengers on the ship went into Annapolis to get something to eat at a local tavern. While they were there, a man walked in. He was wearing a hat and he had a paper attached to it that said "No Stamp Act." This caused a scuffle, and eventually County Delegate John Hammond got into a pretty tough fight with one of the passengers from the Hornet. Lieutenant Mowbray ended up being injured by the time they broke it all up, and the guy that John Hammond fought actually swam back to the Hornet. The protests worked. The stamped paper was supposed to start being sold in November, and not one piece of it ended up being sold. And by March 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. Now, when Annapolis got news of this, they were thrilled, and in fact, here's what happened the afternoon that they found out. The afternoon was spent in mirth, and all loyal and patriotic toasts were drank. People felt pretty confident that they could go back to being good Englishmen again. But Mercy Otis Warren noted, in hindsight, in her History of the American Revolution, that some folks who were paying attention had a different point of view, and this is what she says. She says, "Amidst the demonstration of this lively gratitude, there were some who had the sagacity enough to see that the British ministry was not so much instigated by principles of equity as impelled by necessity. Another act was coming. This wasn't over." All right, per usual, I'm going to include in the description box below an article that goes a little deeper into the Stamp Act and the protests. And that's also going to include a reading list if you want to dive even deeper still into what happened in those days. I'm also going to include a link to a creative, just taking a look at what some of the protests might have been like. So as always, thanks for getting nerdy with me, and I'll see you in the next video.